There's something deeply revealing happening right now, and it has almost nothing to do with Greenland itself. When Donald Trump first floated the idea of acquiring Greenland back in 2019, the world laughed it off as another eccentric presidential whim. But when he returned to the White House in January 2025 and immediately put Greenland back on the table, this time with far more strategic urgency, even suggesting military options weren't off the table, both Beijing and Moscow stopped laughing, and that reaction, that sudden seriousness from two of the most calculating governments on Earth, tells you everything you need to know, because China and Russia don't panic over real estate deals. They panic over something else entirely. And what they're really reacting to isn't Trump's ambition. It's what Greenland's control would permanently lock in place, a geographic, economic, and military checkmate that neither of them can afford to ignore. That's what we're going to unpack today. To understand why this island, this enormous, largely frozen, sparsely populated landmass sitting at the top of the world, has suddenly become the most geopolitically loaded piece of territory on the planet, you have to first understand what kind of world we are actually living in right now, because the mainstream narrative will tell you this is about Trump being theatrical, or about NATO solidarity, or about Denmark's sovereignty being threatened by an impulsive American president. But that framing is almost deliberately designed to miss the point. The real story is about the architecture of the next 100 years of global power, and Greenland is the cornerstone of that architecture in ways that very few analysts are willing to say out loud. Let's start with the geographic reality, because geography is the most honest language in geopolitics. Greenland sits at the crossroads of the Arctic, a vast, increasingly navigable ocean that is transforming before our eyes as ice recedes at an accelerating pace. The Arctic is no longer just a climate story. It has become, in the last decade, one of the most contested strategic theaters on Earth. Russia has already been rebuilding its Arctic military infrastructure at a pace not seen since the Soviet era. China, despite having no Arctic coastline, declared itself a near-Arctic state back in 2018, one of the most audacious geopolitical claims made in recent memory, and has been investing heavily in Arctic shipping research, icebreaker construction, and what it calls the Polar Silk Road. These are not coincidences. These are calculated moves on a chessboard where the stakes are nothing less than control over the next era of global trade routes, resource extraction, and military positioning. Now here's the critical realization I want you to hold in the back of your mind throughout this conversation, and we will fully unpack it in the final part of this script. The battle over Greenland is not really between the United States and Denmark. It is between two fundamentally different visions of what the post-American world order looks like. One vision says that Western institutional power, anchored by American military and economic supremacy, continues to shape global rules. The other vision, the one being constructed in Moscow and Beijing right now, says that the 21st century belongs to a multipolar world where no single nation dominates the arteries of global trade, communication, and military reach. Greenland sits directly at the throat of that question. But to understand why this matters so viscerally to Russia specifically, we have to look at what the Arctic actually means to Moscow's strategic survival. Russia's northern coastline is the longest in the world. The Northern Sea Route, which runs along Russia's Arctic coast from the Barents Sea to the Bering Strait, has become a potential goldmine of commercial and strategic significance. As Arctic ice continues to thin, this route offers a shipping path between Europe and Asia that is dramatically shorter than going through the Suez Canal. For Russia, which has been economically isolated by Western sanctions following the war in Ukraine, this route represents a lifeline, a way to maintain economic relevance and deepen trade ties with Asia, particularly with China, without depending on sea lanes that are effectively controlled or monitored by American naval power. Now imagine an American-controlled Greenland, armed with expanded military infrastructure, advanced sensor networks, and potentially even missile defense or offensive systems positioned in the high north. Suddenly, Russia's most strategically valuable coastline is being watched from across the water by the most sophisticated military intelligence apparatus in human history. That is not a minor inconvenience for Moscow, that is an existential strategic nightmare, and this is where I want to ask you something directly, because I think your perspective matters here. Do you believe that Trump's push for Greenland is a genuine strategic masterstroke, or is it part of a broader pattern of using geopolitical theater to maintain American dominance in an era when that dominance is genuinely slipping? Think about that carefully before you answer, because the honest answer is probably more nuanced than either camp of American political opinion wants to admit. For China, the calculus around Greenland is different, but equally urgent. Beijing's entire economic model over the last 4 decades has been built on export-led growth, which means it is structurally dependent on the uninterrupted flow of goods across global sea lanes. China exports to Europe represent trillions of dollars in annual trade, and the conventional routes go through the South China Sea, the Indian Ocean, the Suez Canal, and into the Mediterranean. These routes pass through multiple choke points that the United States Navy and its allies can effectively close in a serious conflict scenario. The Polar Silk Road, China's Arctic alternative, was designed specifically as a hedge against that vulnerability. A northern route through Arctic waters significantly reduces both the distance and the dependence on those southern choke points. But here's the thing about the Polar Silk Road. It only works as a strategic asset if the Arctic waters it traverses are not dominated by a hostile military power. And a United States that controls Greenland and therefore controls some of the most critical waterways at the Atlantic entrance to the Arctic fundamentally compromises that hedge. Beyond trade routes, Greenland itself is sitting on top of something that both China and Russia understand at a level that most Western media coverage simply fails to communicate adequately. The island contains some of the most significant rare earth mineral deposits on Earth. Elements like neodymium, dysprosium, and praseodymium that are absolutely essential to the manufacturing of electric vehicle batteries, wind turbines, advanced military electronics, and the entire physical infrastructure of what we are calling the green energy transition. Right now, China dominates global rare earth production and processing at a level that gives Beijing extraordinary leverage over virtually every country on Earth that is trying to build a modern technological economy. China doesn't just mine rare earths, it processes roughly 85 to 90% of the world's supply, which means even ore mined in other countries often flows through Chinese facilities before it becomes usable. If the United States were to secure Greenland and develop its rare earth deposits, it would represent one of the single most consequential blows to Chinese economic leverage in a generation. That is not an exaggeration. That is the strategic mathematics that keeps people in Beijing's policy rooms awake at night. But to understand why this moment is so loaded, we also have to look at the broader trajectory of American foreign policy and how Trump's return has scrambled every assumption that both Moscow and Beijing had carefully built into their strategic planning. When Trump first left office in January 2021, both Russia and China made certain calibrated bets. They bet that the Biden administration's multilateralism, its re-engagement with NATO allies, its rules-based order rhetoric would create a kind of predictable adversarial relationship, one where the lines were clear, the institutions were functioning, and the Western coalition held together primarily through shared ideological commitment to liberal democratic norms. That predictability, as frustrating as it was for Moscow and Beijing, was something they could plan around. Trump's return shattered that predictability in ways that are genuinely destabilizing for both powers, but not in the direction that American hawks would like to believe. Here's the paradox that I think is worth sitting with. Trump's confrontational posture toward Greenland, toward Denmark, toward NATO allies in general, has simultaneously made American power more aggressive in its ambitions and less reliable in its alliances. And that combination, aggressive ambition paired with alliance instability, is actually deeply concerning for Beijing and Moscow, not because it makes America stronger, but because it makes America more unpredictable in a nuclear-armed, multi-theater, strategic environment. Unpredictability at that level of military power is not reassuring to anyone. It is genuinely alarming. So, when you see Chinese and Russian officials expressing opposition to American moves in Greenland, understand that beneath the diplomatic language there is a very real anxiety about what an America that is simultaneously withdrawing from multilateral commitments and expanding its territorial ambitions actually looks like over the next decade. Now, I want to pause and ask you something that I think cuts to the heart of this conversation. If you were sitting in Beijing or Moscow right now, looking at an American president who is talking about taking Greenland, who has questioned NATO's Article 5 commitments, who has simultaneously proposed closer economic engagement with Russia while increasing tariff pressure on China, what strategic posture would make the most sense to you? Because the answer to that question reveals something profound about where global power is actually heading, and I'd genuinely like to know what you think. The situation becomes even more layered when you consider the specific military dimensions of Greenland's location. Thule Air Base, now officially renamed Pituffik Space Base, has been an American military installation in Greenland since 1951, and it represents one of the most strategically located military facilities on Earth. It sits within the GI-UK gap, the Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom gap, which is the primary maritime corridor through which Russian submarines would have to pass to reach the open Atlantic in a conflict scenario. During the Cold War, monitoring and controlling the GI-UK gap was central to NATO's anti-submarine warfare strategy. With the current resurgence of Russian submarine activity, which has increased dramatically over the last several years and is now at levels not seen since the late Soviet period, the strategic importance of Greenland-based surveillance and interdiction capabilities has returned with full force. A formalized American control of Greenland beyond the existing basing rights would allow for a permanent, legally unambiguous expansion of that military infrastructure that could effectively make Russian Atlantic submarine operations far more detectable and therefore far more constrained. For Russia's nuclear deterrence doctrine, which relies heavily on submarine-launched ballistic missiles as a survivable second strike capability, that is not just a military inconvenience, it threatens the foundational logic of their nuclear posture, and this is precisely why the Russian response to the Greenland question has been notably sharper and more pointed than their usual diplomatic boilerplate. Russian officials, including senior foreign ministry spokespersons, have explicitly called Trump's Greenland ambitions a destabilizing provocation, language they reserve for situations they consider genuinely threatening rather than merely annoying. That calibrated use of strong language is itself a form of strategic signaling, and if you read it correctly, it tells you that Moscow is treating the Greenland question not as diplomatic theater, but as a potential inflection point in the broader security architecture of the North Atlantic. But to understand why the full picture is even more complex than this military strategic layer, we have to look at something that rarely gets discussed in mainstream geopolitical analysis, and this is where that critical realization I mentioned earlier starts to fully come into focus. The opposition from Beijing and Moscow to American control of Greenland is not just about the specific military and economic consequences I've been describing. It is about the signal that such a move would send about the nature of American power in the 21st century. Because for the last several years, both China and Russia have been constructing a very deliberate narrative, not just for domestic consumption, but for the entire global South, that the era of Western unilateralism is over, that the United States and its allies operate by rules they invent for themselves and impose on others, that sovereignty and territorial integrity are principles the West applies selectively depending on whether the country in question is an ally or an adversary. That narrative has been enormously effective. It has resonated in Africa, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, in precisely the regions where the competition for influence between the Western-led order and the emerging multipolar alternative is most actively being contested. Now consider what it looks like to a leader in Nairobi or Jakarta or Riyadh when the United States, the same country that invokes international law and sovereign integrity as the foundation of its foreign policy rhetoric, is openly discussing the acquisition of an autonomous territory against the stated wishes of both the territory's residents and its sovereign nation. The hypocrisy gap that this creates is not a minor embarrassment, it is a strategic gift to Beijing and Moscow of extraordinary value. Every time an American official talks about taking Greenland, China and Russia don't need to say anything. They just need to let the global South draw its own conclusions. And those conclusions that American power operates on a different moral and legal standard than it demands of others are exactly the conclusions that are driving countries across the developing world to hedge away from the American-led system and toward the institutions and frameworks that Beijing and Moscow are constructing as alternatives. This is the deeper game that I think most analysts are missing entirely. The opposition to American control of Greenland from China and Russia is not primarily defensive, it is opportunistic. Every aggressive or hypocritical move that Washington makes in this domain becomes raw material for the counter-narrative that Beijing and Moscow are running globally. They don't need to win the Greenland argument, they just need America to keep making arguments that the rest of the world finds unconvincing. Let me ask you one more question before we bring this fully together, because I think it's the question that matters most. At what point does American strategic overreach begin to produce outcomes that are directly contrary to American interests, not because adversaries outmaneuver Washington militarily, but because American behavior alienates the very nations whose cooperation is essential to maintaining any kind of coherent global order? I ask because I think that threshold is closer than most people in Washington are willing to acknowledge. Here is where the critical realization I planted at the beginning of this conversation fully lands. The battle over Greenland is ultimately a battle over which vision of international order prevails in the second half of this century. And what makes this moment so uniquely consequential is that both sides of that battle are making strategic errors. Washington is pursuing territorial ambitions in a way that undermines the rule-based rhetoric it needs to maintain coalition solidarity. Beijing and Moscow are building an alternative order that is held together more by shared opposition to American power than by any coherent positive vision of what global governance should look like. The world is essentially watching two competing and deeply flawed frameworks fighting for supremacy over the planet's most strategically sensitive real estate, and Greenland has become the physical symbol of that contest. The tragedy in all of this is that the people who actually live in Greenland, the Greenlandic people, the Inuit communities, whose ancestors have lived on that land for thousands of years, are essentially being treated as a footnote in a conversation about power that was written by people thousands of miles away. Their desire for independence, their right to determine their own future, their complex and difficult relationship with Danish colonial history, all of that disappears when geopolitical analysts and American presidents start talking about strategic minerals and Arctic sea routes. And that erasure is itself a moral indictment of how the great power competition is being conducted by all parties involved. What I hope you take away from today's conversation is not simply that Beijing and Moscow oppose Trump's Greenland ambitions. That is the surface story, and surface stories are almost always the least interesting part of what is actually happening. What I hope you see is the deeper architecture, the way that a single piece of frozen geography has become the focal point of a civilizational contest about sovereignty, resources, military power, and the moral credibility of competing visions for how the world should be organized. And the next time you see a headline about Greenland, about the Arctic, about rare earth minerals, about Russian submarine activity or Chinese polar expeditions, I hope you see not isolated news events, but threads in a tapestry that has been decades in the making and that will define the world your children and grandchildren inherit. The chessboard is real, the pieces are moving, and Greenland is the square that changes everything.